Barack Obama published his memoir, Dreams from My Father, A Story of Race and Inheritance, in 1995 at the age of 33. His publisher said that I knew that Obama had big ambitions and he was up to something big because which 33-year-old publishes a memoir? So he was definitely up to something. What was Obama up to? This is what we're going to explore from a theoretical and a practical perspective in our episode today. Now, to understand that, I'm going to introduce a topic, a concept coined by the Nobel laureate Thomas Schelling. He got a Nobel laureate in economics, and he comes up with this concept of a focal point. So, a focal point, according to Schelling, is essentially that point at which many players would coordinate in the absence of any communication between the players. So, for example, if you are on an airport and if in case you don't have any mobile phones and you and another friend are going to be meeting, how are you going to decide where to meet? And to solve this problem, airports generally have a meeting point somewhere, and that meeting point is an arbitrary mark that can indicate to people that, hey, if you're trying to meet each other, this is where you should meet. Because without a meeting point, I might think that you like bookstores, so I might go out looking at the bookstores to find you, or you might think that I like cafes, so you might be looking for me at the cafes, or I might think that you think that I will be at the cafe, so I will go at the cafe, but you might think that I will think that you're at the bookstore, so you will be at the bookstore, and we would not be able to find each other in any case. How do we solve this problem? We create a focal point. The airport authorities create a focal point by putting a meeting point at the terminal. So, in the absence of communication, we both can have mutual expectations that we will meet at this particular point. Now, it should be clear by now that if there are multiple focal points, there's a problem, but we'll deal with that problem later on. The idea over here is that any arbitrary point can become focal and can become a coordinating device. Now, Kaushik Basu takes this concept of focal points and applies it to individuals. So he says that a leader can also be a focal person. uh, in his paper Humes to Hobbes with a Dash of Nash, he talks about a leader who creates a focal point, and any leader who creates a focal point becomes a focal person. So imagine that you're in a group of friends and you're deciding where do we go out to eat, and nobody has made a suggestion, and one person in your group says that, hey, how about we go to that particular cafe? So that person has created by suggestion a focal point, and that person becomes a focal person because he or she has solved a coordination problem where everybody was just thinking, where do we head? Where do we go? That suggestion has created a particular focal point where everybody can decide to then meet or converge. Now, I did similar informal experiments at Cornell University where I asked people that if you had no mobile phones and on a weekend your friends and you decided that you'll meet somewhere on campus, where would you meet? And you cannot communicate with each other in advance. And most of the people said that they would meet at the clock tower at Cornell. Okay, so if the time is decided 12 p.m., we'll meet at Cornell, they would usually figure out that they are going to be meeting at the clock tower because they expect others to be thinking that everybody else would meet at the clock tower. The clock tower becomes a focal point over there. Now, again, applying that to the idea of a focal person, here is how a person really becomes a focal person, because our inquiry over here is that how do you become a focal person? Is it arbitrary? Is it just by saying that, no, hey, I'm a focal person, or just by giving a suggestion that amidst so many strategies, let us just follow that particular strategy? Well, it's almost that. So let me just explain that to you by an example from a book called An Architect's Guide to Fame. So this book's first chapter talks about two very famous British architects called Alison and Peter Smithson. The Smithsons were a couple, husband and wife, and they defined the new brutalist movement post World War II. The new brutalist movement was an architectural movement where buildings were made for utility, not so much for decoration or aesthetic purposes. And if you've seen those buildings with streets in the sky, the Smithsons are considered as the pioneers for that particular design. The Smithsons are particularly famous in the architectural tradition, and this chapter in this book really tries to figure out why were the Smithsons so famous after all. And what they find is that the Smithsons really talked about their work quite a lot. They wrote books about their work, they made movies on their work, and not just on their work, on the back end. So they gave you a view of the backstage of the process in which they were creating their work. They would record everything. A lot of times they would even just keep records of random ideas, maybe just one line that they might have written, and would put a date on it, and they would record all of these things as if they were part of some very important history. And why were they doing it? The reason for that is that uh, the authors of this chapter, they find that they took advice from a very famous French painter called Marcel Duchamp. Duchamp was a very good friend of a friend of the Smithsons called Henderson, who was a photographer, and he met Duchamp in France, and Duchamp said that, do not throw away anything, record everything that you have. You must take your work seriously. And Duchamp used to have this green box in which he would keep all of his unfinished artworks, all of his ideas, uh, everything that could almost be a collectible in the future, to give a view of the process of his work, the back end process that led to his work. And the Smithsons pretty much picked up that idea, and just like Duchamp's green box, they created their own magic box in which they recorded all their writings, their rough works, uh, etc., etc. In addition to that, not only did they give a backstage view of the process of their work, they also gave people an insight into their own personal lives. So, their own celebrations, their own, personal dynamics, their family, their relationships, their various milestones of life. They gave people an insider view of that. So, the writers say that they almost gave a voyeurism by consent. People could peep into their lives, and they had given people the consent to do that, and that fed a lot into their fame. What these writers of this chapter also say that in many ways they became their own historians. So the Smithsons also sort of handholded their critiques and helped them view their own work in a particular light. So, for example, the Smithsons would say that in our first era, we were thinking about the society in this manner. In our second era, we were thinking about the society in that manner. Now, these eras were really being defined by the Smithsons, but what it did was for a critique or for somebody who's reflecting on how architecture has developed, Smithson's own work gave a lens, gave a framework for the critique to look at their work. So, uh, think of it in terms of the third phase of power that we have discussed earlier, that you are already giving a lens to somebody to look at the world, and that world is of your own creation. So the Smithsons were able to do that by taking their work seriously, by reflecting on their work seriously, and by giving a lens to other critiques to look at their work. Now, the idea over here is that that made Smithsons really, really famous. The interesting bit is that, according to the writers of this chapter, the Smithsons were really able to do this is because Smithsons never really worked a lot. So the proportion of the writings on their work and their own writings on their work is a lot more than their actual work itself. If you compare them to other big architects, the Smithsons have produced much lesser number of buildings. So the work is, you know, limited, but at the same time they spent a lot of time teaching, they spent a lot of time writing, they spent a lot of time reflecting on their work in a very public manner. And that is why, even if, there are many architects who even say that actually the Smithson's work was not all that great. Many critical artists would say that, or architects would say that. But still, if you take the name of the Smithsons in architectural circles, you would get sage nods. You would get, signals that would tell you that Smithsons are really, really revered in that particular field. The idea over here is that in many ways, in a world where people have infinite number of strategies available to them, in a world where people don't know the game that they're in, everybody is looking for blueprints. Everybody is looking for some sort of a pathway or some sort of a set of strategies that somebody else might have adopted. And whatever is available, whatever comes to people's mind, or whatever becomes accessible to people, they take it up and consciously or subconsciously adopt some of those strategies or take inspiration from some of those strategies that are available. So if you look at what Obama was doing, Obama was essentially presenting his own life story, giving some voyeurism by consent, and giving a lens to people to look at his own life. And through that, people began taking Obama as an example, or they began taking Obama, in Carl Jung's terms, an archetype. It's interesting. Let me actually dwell on Carl Jung's work on this a little bit. Carl Jung wrote a book called Man and His Symbols. What he essentially says is that there are certain symbols that exist in our collective consciousness. There are certain symbols that you would find all across the world. You know, these symbols, and these are, usually geometrical figures. These symbols are somewhat innate to our personalities, or to, something deep within us identifies with these symbols. And then he extends his logic and says that a lot of times people also create idealized images of others, or, in many religions like Hinduism, you create gods, because those gods become encoded symbols of certain characteristics, certain strategies by which you can connect, and by which you could also take inspiration for living your life. Okay, that's the reason why people read biographies. That's the reason why people identify with, historical icons. Now, once you have those symbols, you tend to take those symbols as blueprints for your own strategies in life. So, in many ways, those symbols create focal points for you. And in creating focal points for you, those symbols become focal persons, especially if those symbols are embedded in a personality. So, that personality becomes a focal person. So, what's really happening is that in a world where there's so much of confusion and there are so many changing things, these blueprints are almost like putting a label on your own forehead and saying that, hey, I am a focal person. Or it is the act of choosing a random arbitrary place in the airport and putting the placard meeting point. So by doing that, you're creating a focal point. The best thing would be for anybody who's seeking power to put that placard onto themselves and to declare that, hey, I'm a focal person and this is how I solve problems. This is an insight into my life. And people would automatically start getting attracted, or people would start uh, using those images, those stories, those strategies to navigate their own lives. And in many ways, if we go back to the discussion of, do we need power to have power, you in many ways would find that your own declaration that, hey, I'm a focal person, creates or sparks those initial steps or initial bit of your power. Actually, the reason why I got interested in this was I was inquiring that where does power actually come from, and in that inquiry I started looking at dynasties. I started looking at various kings, and what I found was that if you trace it back, you would typically see that you know uh, a dynasty emanated from a person who was already a minor nobility, or was ruling a small area, or was some sort of a mayor, or a general in the army. But then it did not satisfy my inquiry, because I thought that, why why did this particular person become the big dynast, and how did this particular person come in that position of a minor nobility, or of being a minor lord, or being a general? And that tracing did not lead to anywhere. So then I started looking at first time leaders. So Obama being an example, uh, Nelson Mandela being an example in many cases, Mahatma Gandhi being an example, Motilal Nehru, Narendra Modi, all of these are examples. And if you actually look at it, a lot of them wrote their own autobiographies or commissioned biographies. And the reason behind that is that very Jungian Carl Jung's instinct, or that idea that you become an archetype first, and you give an insight into your story and into your strategies to people, and write about the process of your work, write about your work, and write about your personal life. And once you have sufficient number of your stories out there, it will take a life of its own. So essentially, the idea is that, how are focal points created, or how are focal persons created? Well, others can also make you a focal person, but one very common way of doing that is to declare, put your hand up and declare that I am a focal person, and then you start on that pathway to power. So, this is one way, or this is one strand where we track the origin of power. In subsequent videos, we will, both academically and through practical examples, trace and track other strands of the origin of power, and then get into the mechanisms of power, etc., etc.